It was one of the richest cities in America. Today, it's a 139 square mile graveyard of industrial ambition, the most spectacular urban collapse in modern history. In 1950, Detroit stood as America's fifth largest city with 1.85 million people, a manufacturing colossus that had just spent a decade churning out bombers to help win the Second World War. Today, just 639,000 people call the place home, in a city with a landmass bigger than Boston, San Francisco, and Manhattan combined. But the truth that many people don't know is that Detroit's death blow didn't come from Toyota or NAFTA or Chinese steel, or at least didn't alone. The trends out of the city began well before any of those really took off. The city that partially invented the middle class was abandoned by the very companies that built it. What happened to Detroit goes beyond merely decline. It was the result of multiple disasters hitting the city simultaneously: manufacturing decentralization, racial tensions, political dysfunction, and financial mismanagement, all colliding to create one of the most spectacular urban collapses in American history. This is the story of how Motor City collapsed, hit rock bottom, and tried to stage a comeback, and what lessons it offers for other cities that are facing similar pressures. Giants. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. This is very much the case with Detroit, and no doubt part of the reason that its fall's been oh so dramatic. The romanticized version of Detroit's history is that it remained a sprawling automotive manufacturing hub until globalization took the jobs and sent them overseas. While globalization trends in the 90s and beyond certainly did impact the city, the trends, they date back much further than many people realize. The truth is that pretty much immediately following the end of World War II, the city started bleeding manufacturing jobs. It wasn't obvious to anyone at the time, and nobody could have seen where it was going to end up, but the trend was there, and it was universally flowing in one direction: out. Between 1947 and 1963, supposedly some of the city's golden years, Detroit lost over 150,000 manufacturing jobs. But you might be wondering, well, how's this possible? I mean, this happened in Motor City. That's home of the big three manufacturers: Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. And it happened during a booming economy and an insatiable desire for cars. How could this be possible? The answer is that automobile manufacturers had already set their sights elsewhere. Between 1945 and 1957, the big three automakers built 25 new manufacturing plants in the Detroit metro area, yet 0 were built inside the city limits. This was a stunning shift that had nothing to do with foreign competition and everything to do with strategy. There are a lot of factors at play here, some of which are more nefarious than others. On the most basic level, many of the factories built in Detroit were done so in the early 1900s. While designed to build cars, they were the first of their kind and built for a population that largely didn't have any. The city was the only place they could build them in order to ensure their workforce could get there each day. But these were problematic. As demand ramped up, companies needed to produce more and more. The multi-story factories in the cities were not exactly ideal for production on this scale. If you ever tried carrying car parts up multiple flights of stairs, even the lifting that could be mechanized still created a lag in productivity. So they looked elsewhere, and on a big scale. Sprawling, single-story factories began popping up all over the Midwest, pretty much everywhere but the big cities. And they weren't just expanding. They were replacing. When General Motors opened new plants in Livonia and Pontiac, they simultaneously scaled back operations within Detroit city limits. Chrysler's new facilities in Sterling Heights came as they reduced their Detroit workforce. The pattern was unmistakable. The auto industry was conducting a deliberate, systematic withdrawal from the city that it had given birth to. And the maths made sense. Land in the suburbs cost a fraction of what it did in the city. The new plants were designed for the automobile age. Massive parking lots for workers who would drive, not walk, or take trains to work. Race was another huge factor, especially in the early days of plants leaving the city. The black population in the city had exploded from just 6,000 in 1910 to over 300,000 in 1950, driven by the Great Migration from the South to places like Detroit. The companies built their plants along highways and deliberately placed them beyond the reach of public transit lines. They recruited heavily from white neighborhoods in rural Michigan. And they did this because they saw integration as a threat to their ability to maintain production stability, which is exactly what anti-integrationists wanted. When the Packard plant had promoted 3 black workers to the aircraft assembly line in 1943, 25,000 white workers walked off the job in protest. The message was clear. Integration meant halting operations. Given black workers' heavier dependence on public transit, shifting locations to the suburbs largely prevented this issue from raising its head, at least for a time. Beyond race, organized labor itself was a factor in the move out of Detroit. The city was the most heavily unionized in America, and the United Auto Workers had grown incredibly powerful through strikes and organizing. The 1945 to 1946 UAW strikes at General Motors lasted 113 days and involved 320,000 workers nationwide, with Detroit at its epicenter. The city developed a reputation for labor militancy, which became something of a liability. Executives didn't explicitly say that they were moving out of the city to reduce the power of unions, but they didn't need to say it explicitly. The new suburban plants were much harder to organize in. Workers who drove to isolated facilities were less likely to strike than those who walked to factories in dense neighborhoods. By the 1960s, the writing really was on the wall. Detroit's industrial age was on the slide. And where the jobs went, the people were going to follow. Cities' populations, they're rarely stagnant over the years, and some bleed people more than others. But what happened to Detroit was different. This was mass abandonment on a scale rarely seen before. The numbers tell a story of urban collapse rarely seen in American history. From its peak of 1.85 million in 1950, Detroit had lost over 1.2 million residents, a 65% decline that represents one of the greatest percentage losses for any major American city. To put that into perspective, Detroit has lost more people than the total current populations of Baltimore and Milwaukee combined. The exodus began slowly, almost imperceptibly. In the 1950s, Detroit lost 180,000 residents. Sure, it's concerning, but not exactly catastrophic. Many cities were seeing modest declines given the rise of the American suburbs, but Detroit's losses accelerated with time. Then, July 1967 rolled around, and that changed everything. A police raid on an after-hours club at 12th and Claremont spiked 5 days of chaos that left 43 dead, over 1,400 buildings burned, and $45 million in damages. That's over $400 million in today's money. The raid itself became the spark for something much larger. The club was celebrating the return of 2 Vietnam veterans, and when police arrested all 82 patrons instead of just citing the owners, a crowd gathered. In a neighborhood where unemployment exceeded 30% and tensions between the predominantly white police force and black residents had been building for years. And that spark found plenty of fuel. Governor George Romney called in the National Guard, and President Johnson even stepped in and called in the U.S. Army's 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to help restore order. The underlying issues were real. Detroit's police force was 93% white in a city that was nearly 40% black. Housing discrimination trapped black families in overcrowded neighborhoods while whites fled to the suburbs. They were successful in bringing the rioting to a halt, but the damage was done, and we're not just talking financially. For many, this was the final straw that confirmed what they had long known, but weren't quite ready to admit. Detroit was a broken city, and they wanted less and less to do with it every year. The violence didn't accomplish much of anything, and it only exacerbated the exodus. For many white residents watching their city burn on the evening news, this confirmed their decision to leave. For black residents, it marked the beginning of their own eventual departure as jobs and services disappeared, along with the tax base. Much of the exodus from post-war Detroit stemmed from white suburbanization, and black outmigration remained minimal through the 1960s and 70s. During this 20-year time span, Detroit's overall population fell by more than 300,000 during a time when the black population actually grew. This trend would continue, though upwardly mobile blacks began joining their white counterparts on the way out of the city in larger and larger numbers in the 80s and 90s. The black middle class, while considerably smaller than their white counterparts, only picked up speed on their way out. While they got a later start, the statistics are clear. Between 1990 and 2020, Detroit's black population fell from 778,000 to 496,000. The pattern was established. Once you had the ability to get out, you damn well did. This was the grim reality that Coleman Young inherited when he became Detroit's first black mayor in 1974. His response to the crisis was confrontational from the start. He saw the suburbs as something of a parasite that was growing fat off Detroit's decline, and he wasn't exactly shy to say so. He famously announced that criminals in the city should hit 8 Mile Road, the city's northern boundary, and keep going into the suburbs. This wasn't exactly welcomed by its neighbors, with the mayor of Oak Park declaring that he was intentionally picking fights with the suburbs. When suburban leaders proposed regional cooperation, Young scoffed and repeatedly refused to cooperate with planning bodies for city-suburb development. This us versus them rhetoric was very popular with his base, who saw him as the first mayor to finally stand up to decades of suburban exploitation and racism. But it did come at a cost. It deepened regional divides precisely at the moment Detroit needed cooperation the most, and it branded the city as hostile to outsiders. This popularity helped him to win 5 straight elections. But no amount of support could change the maths of the situation. Every departure meant less tax revenue, which meant worse services, which triggered even more departures. It was a death spiral that Young never managed to pull the city out of. As businesses and people continued to flee the city, they left behind a vacuum which gangs and crimes were oh so happy to fill. The transformation's as staggering as it is tragic. Michigan as a whole saw murder skyrocket from 284 in 1964 to 1,186 just a decade later, with the vast majority of these murders coming from Detroit. The city that had built America's middle class had become its killing field. Murder may have made the headlines the most, but there were many other crimes that became all too common as part of Detroit's lived experience. Between 1960 and 1970, armed robbery increased more than 300%. Auto theft in the city that kind of invented the automobile became so common that insurance companies raised Detroit's premiums to astronomical levels, which for many meant that they couldn't afford insurance at all. It got so extreme that the state Supreme Court even ruled that the insurance system had effectively failed Detroit, making coverage neither affordable nor available for many of its residents. And then crack came along. The crack epidemic of the 80s was nearly custom-built for Detroit, cheap to make, instantly addictive, enormously profitable. A teen with $100 and little career opportunities could turn it into $500 in a day. They were making more in a week than their parents, sometimes combined. In a city where legitimate jobs were vanishingly rare, the drug trade became the only growth industry in sight for many people. And Young Boys Incorporated showed how it was done. Started by teenagers on Detroit's west side, YBI at their peak was taking in $400,000 weekly. That's $20.8 million a year. More than many legitimate corporations. In today's money, that's $1 million each week at about $62 million a year. They recruited children as young as 10 to be lookouts and paid teenagers better than any other job they could get. They had a better business model than General Motors. Quality control, territorial expansion, you name it, they had it. When members got arrested, YBI paid their bail and their legal fees. The territorial wars that followed turned Detroit into a mini war zone divided by gang control and feuds. The Chambers brothers operated out of a series of apartments on East Grand Boulevard. Best Friends, another group, ran the east side, their leader, Rock and Reggie Brown, maintaining control through a reign of violence, ordering executions, including against a 3-year-old. The city's response was deeply schizophrenic at best, ranging from special teams of police officers that had broad authorization to engage in violence to wildly contradictory positions on whether to negotiate with or confront the gangs. Young's administration oscillated between crackdowns that resulted in mass arrests and unofficial truces that gave gangs de facto control over certain territories. The Detroit Police Department hemorrhaged officers just like the city hemorrhaged people, from 5,000 cops to 2,708 by 2012, during a period in which violent crime absolutely had skyrocketed. Response times for top priority emergency calls stretched an average of 58 minutes. Imagine calling 911 while someone's breaking down your door and being told that help might arrive in about an hour. For property crime, they often just stopped responding entirely, overwhelmed with other crimes that they had to deal with in their chronically understaffed department. You got robbed, you filed a report for insurance, and you moved on with your life. By 2012, things had gotten so bad that the police union handed out flyers warning visitors to enter at your own risk, and they weren't being dramatic. Meanwhile, the drug economy had moved from competing with the traditional economy to nearly replacing it in large parts of the city. By the 1990s, you had entire family trees in the drug trade, an increasingly inherited position because that was all they knew growing up. Even the schools were not safe. Well before the rise of mass school shootings began to grip the nation, the proliferation of guns in the country started to play out more and more frequently at school. In 1987, a 14-year-old walked into Murray Wright High School and shot a football player dead because of a clash they were having over a girl. That was the moment that things began to change, and the city became increasingly militarized. Metal detectors began popping up around school entrances, and then there were armed guards. By the 2000s, entering a Detroit public school was like entering a prison, but fortifying the schools, it couldn't solve what was happening inside them or to them. The security measures were fighting a losing battle on two fronts. Violence had become so endemic that metal detectors couldn't stop the real problem. Schools had become recruiting grounds for gangs, with territorial disputes turning hallways into battlefields. Students weren't just bringing weapons, they were bringing the streets inside with them. But violence at schools was only one symptom of a much larger disease. Across Detroit, the basic functions of city government were beginning to fail. As people fled and violence raged on the streets of Detroit, the city's ability to function and carry out basic services became more and more of a challenge. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. As early as 1978, with the city hemorrhaging both people and jobs, Detroit was spending more than it collected. Coleman Young's administration tried pretty much every approach that they could think of. Layoffs, service cuts, desperate appeals to Washington, but none of these panned out in the size or scale that would be necessary. By the early 80s, with Michigan's unemployment hitting 17%, the highest since the Great Depression and considerably higher inside city limits, the city was collecting pennies on the dollar of what it needed. Streetlights started going dark, first a few, then entire blocks. By 2014, an estimated half of the city's 88,000 streetlights were dead. Entire neighborhoods sat in darkness, which provided the perfect cover for even more crime. Residents organized patrols with flashlights just to walk to their cars. The darkness became so pervasive that satellite images showed Detroit at night looking like a checkerboard of black squares amid scattered points of light. Nothing exemplifies this collapse quite like the school system in Detroit, though. At its peak, public schools here were educating 300,000. That was in the mid-60s. By 2018, that number had dropped to just 50,000, and the conditions for those remaining became increasingly visible and problematic. Decades of deferred maintenance had created a different kind of danger. Asbestos flaked from ceiling tiles, lead paint peeled from walls in sheets, roofs collapsed from water damage, flooding entire floors. In some buildings, mushrooms grew from water-damaged walls in a grotesque symbol of neglect that would become infamous when photos circulated nationally. Winter temperatures in classrooms dropped to near freezing when boilers failed. These weren't schools anymore, they were health hazards. With textbooks, the decline of the education being provided here was even worse, if less immediately visible. By 2009, Detroit had one of the lowest performing urban districts in the whole country. Only 7% of 8th graders were proficient in reading. In maths, that number was 4%. Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick's tenure didn't do them any favors. Having run on a platform of resurrecting the city, his time in office was marked by corruption on an ungodly scale. He took bribes, he rigged contracts, and charged as much as $210,000 in personal travel to the city. While he was ultimately sentenced to 28 years in federal prison, which does mark one of the longest sentences ever given for public corruption, it came too late to stop the damage that he'd done to the city. The 2008 financial crisis, it delivered what seemed to be the final blow. General Motors and Chrysler, which maintained some presence in the city, still declared bankruptcy. People were discussing the total collapse of the American automotive industry. Unemployment hit 25%. In some neighborhoods, it exceeded 50%. Houses that sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars in 2000 were literally being given away. The Wayne County Treasurer held auctions where you could buy a house with starting bids at $500. All of this came to a head in 2013 when Governor Rick Snyder appointed Kevin Orr as an emergency manager, essentially suspending democracy in the city. The mayor remained in office, but became something of a figurehead without control over the fiscal side of the city's operations. He had lost legitimacy in the eyes of Detroit's residents as well as the state. Orr's assessment was both brutal and one of the first honest ones to come out about the scale of challenge faced by the city. By his estimates, the city owed between $18 and $20 billion, with annual reserves of about $1.5 billion. There was no way that this could be managed. The writing was on the wall, and on July the 18th, 2013, Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. The city that had symbolized American prosperity had gone belly up. Now, at a certain point, situations like these hit a rock bottom. While not impossible to sink lower, it would certainly require some effort. Mike Duggan was elected in 2013 on a platform that was shockingly modest yet clearly resonated with people. Quote, "Every neighborhood has a future." Detroit had fallen so far that anyone talking about racial overhauls to completely revitalize the city and turn it into the Dubai of the Midwest were fanciful. What the city needed was a back-to-basics approach. But this wasn't going to be easy, given the scale of the situation. The city was emerging from bankruptcy and had no money, no credit, no credibility. Duggan's first challenge was darkness. Remember now, half the streetlights in Detroit were dead or completely broken, with many of them having been that way for years. This exacerbated the problems of crime, as entire blocks sat in total darkness, providing perfect cover. The city couldn't afford to do a project on the scale by itself, so Duggan's team got creative. They issued a new series of bonds to fund a complete replacement with 65,000 new LED lights. It took 3 years and $185 million, but in 2016, Detroit was looking brighter than it had in decades. The abandoned buildings were another disaster that needed addressing. They sat rotting, providing bases of operation for all sorts of nefarious activities. It was like a contagion. The more abandoned buildings sat in an area, the more it dragged down property values, which only exacerbated the crisis of people fleeing. Many sold their houses at losses just to stop the bleeding. Previous mayors had all promised demolition. Duggan actually delivered it. Using a combination of federal funds, city bonds, and land sales, his administration demolished over 20,000 structures. These were not beautification projects. It was a form of triage. Revitalization of the downtown area had begun before Duggan was elected, with Quicken Loans relocating their headquarters from the Livonia suburb to Detroit in 2010, bringing 1,700 jobs with them. Duggan enthusiastically welcomed such moves, fast-tracking development incentives and putting the city firmly on a pro-development track. Since then, Quicken Loans' CEO has invested an additional $5.6 billion into the city, purchasing over 100 properties, which were revitalized. But then came something truly revolutionary. Ford. The company that had abandoned Detroit decades earlier was convinced to return, or at least return in part. In 2018, Ford announced that it would spend $740 million renovating Michigan Central Station, the massive abandoned train depot that had become Detroit's most famous ruin, and it was going to turn it into an innovation campus. This wasn't going to be a return to the days of multi-story factories filled with blue-collar workers, but it nevertheless represented a rebirth and renewal that would have been seen as next to impossible just a decade previously. The numbers, they did start to turn. Crime dropped dramatically, the murder rate at a 59-year low, 203 homicides in 2024, the lowest since 1965. The downtown area's occupancy ticked up again as businesses, restaurants, and bars started sprouting up in neighborhoods that had largely been abandoned. Tech companies including Google, Microsoft, and Amazon opened offices, all in Detroit. The political numbers told their own story of transformation. Duggan's approval ratings reached 84% in 2025, making him the most popular mayor in Detroit's modern history. In 2020, he had enjoyed a 68% approval rating, already the highest of any Detroit mayor. The man who ran on fixing the basics had become a civic hero, and these changes have been nothing short of revolutionary compared to what the city was going through for the last half-century. But they remain only the start to what Detroit needs, and have been very concentrated in where they've taken place, which happens to be almost exclusively in the greater downtown area. Drive 50 minutes out in any direction from the Renaissance Center, and you're back in the ruins. Poverty exceeds 30%. The median household income is $38,000, roughly half the national average. The schools have improved ever so slightly, but that's hardly saying much given where they came from. They still remain some of the worst in America. The types of jobs that the downtown revival has brought are largely incompatible with the skill set of the local population. These are largely white-collar jobs that require a college degree to even get an interview for. But given just how much of the blue-collar work has already been automated and how poor the public school system is in the city, what are these people supposed to do? What jobs are right for them? The fundamental challenge, it remains unchanged. How do you maintain a city this size with such a diminished population? Even with this revival, Detroit collects less in total taxes than it did in 1960, after accounting for inflation. The infrastructure still requires billions that the city doesn't have, and likely never will. Meanwhile, the suburbs have prospered without Detroit. Oakland County's median household income is $95,000. The schools rank among Michigan's best. The very communities that absorbed Detroit's fleeing middle class now thrive, while the city that created them struggles to maintain basic services. Detroit today is the story of a city that found rock bottom after a very, very steep fall. After losing 65% of its population, declaring the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, and becoming a global symbol of urban failure, it has achieved some sort of stability. The patient survived, but with massive organ failure. What happened here is not unique, it was just faster and more complete than elsewhere. The forces that destroyed Detroit don't stop at city limits. The lesson is brutal, but it's simple. Economic change does not care about history. The companies that grew up in Detroit moved on when it made sense and didn't stop to think about the implications that their decisions would have. But 640,000 people still call Detroit home. They're not statistics, they're Americans trying to answer a question the country has struggled with for decades. What comes next after deindustrialization? Detroit remains a cautionary tale, a city that put America on wheels and played a large role in the creation of the American middle class, and it now shows us what happens when those foundations crumble. These sorts of economic revolutions were concentrated in the last century on things like manufacturing, but will be spreading to new sectors. The question isn't whether other cities will face Detroit's challenges, but if they'll handle them any better. Thank you for watching.